Mark had always considered himself an attentive husband. 7 years of marriage to Emily had taught him that love wasn't just in the big gestures, the fancy vacations, or the anniversary gifts, but in the everyday moments, the small things, like how she tapped her fingers on the counter when she was lost in thought, or the way she hummed under her breath when she cooked. It was in the way she always left a note in his lunchbox when he had long shifts at work. Their life was comfortable. Maybe a little predictable, sure, but stable. They had a modest home on the edge of town, a small circle of close friends, and the kind of relationship where they could finish each other's sentences without thinking. Mark had never thought of himself as the suspicious type. He wasn't the guy who checked his wife's phone or second-guessed every innocent interaction. They trusted each other. At least he thought they did. That Friday afternoon felt like any other day. Mark had left the office earlier than expected. His last meeting of the day was canceled, giving him a rare chance to head home before the sun dipped too low. As he drove down the familiar suburban streets toward their house, he felt a lightness in his chest. It wasn't often that he got to come home early and surprise Emily. Maybe they could open a bottle of wine, sit out on the porch, and talk like they used to when they first got married. When he pulled into the driveway, everything seemed normal. Emily's car was parked in its usual spot. The curtains in the living room were drawn halfway, sunlight slanting through the windows. Even the dog, Charlie, came trotting up to the front door like always, tail wagging, happy to see him. But as soon as Mark stepped inside, something felt off. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't anything obvious. There were no raised voices, no unusual sounds coming from the house. But there was a strange weight in the air, a tension he couldn't quite place. He set his keys down quietly on the hallway table and walked toward the living room. That's when he saw her. Emily was standing at the ironing board, her back to him, focused on smoothing out the wrinkles of a neatly pressed men's shirt. At first glance, the scene seemed perfectly ordinary. She ironed Mark's shirts all the time. But as he took a few steps closer, he realized something was wrong. It wasn't his shirt. He knew his own clothes, the fabric, the fit, and this wasn't one of his. It was a dark blue button-up, slightly slimmer than anything he owned. And then it clicked. It was Alex's shirt. Mark froze. For a moment, his mind went blank. Then the questions started flooding in all at once. Why was she ironing his brother's shirt? Why was his brother's shirt even here? Why had Alex been over? And why hadn't she mentioned it? He cleared his throat. What are you doing? Emily startled slightly, turning her head toward him. She hadn't heard him come in. Her eyes widened in surprise for a brief second, and then she smiled. Oh, I didn't expect you home so soon. There was something in her voice, a faint edge of nervousness, maybe, that made Mark's chest tighten. He took a step closer. Yeah, I got off early. What's with the shirt? She glanced down at it like she had forgotten it was in her hands. It's Alex's. He, left it here the other day. I told him I'd iron it for him. Her tone was light, casual. Too casual. Mark crossed his arms. Since when do you iron Alex's clothes? Emily gave a small shrug. He asked. He's terrible at this stuff. You know how he is. And he didn't know how Alex was. Mark's younger brother had always been the laid-back type. Charming, a little irresponsible, always winging it through life. It wasn't hard to imagine him showing up with a wrinkled shirt and asking for help. But still, something about this didn't sit right. Mark looked at her carefully. She wasn't meeting his eyes the way she usually did when they talked. She kept glancing down at the shirt, running her fingers along the fabric. Her hands seemed restless. When did he come by? Mark asked. Yesterday, Emily said quickly. He only stayed for a few minutes. I guess he was on his way to something. I don't know. Mark frowned. And he just asked you to iron his shirt? Emily sighed. Mark, why are you acting so weird about this? It's just a shirt. Maybe she was right. Maybe he was overthinking it. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His mind started racing through the possibilities. Was there something she wasn't telling him? Was there some reason Alex had been over when Mark wasn't home? He took a slow breath, trying to calm the knot tightening in his chest. I'm not acting weird, he said. I just didn't expect to come home and see you ironing my brother's clothes. Emily put the iron down with a soft click. Well, now you know, she said lightly. It's not a big deal, but it felt like a big deal. It felt like something he couldn't explain. Mark stood there for a moment, watching her fold the shirt neatly and set it aside. She moved with the same ease she always had, but to him, it looked different now. Stiffer, like she was trying too hard to act normal. He wanted to ask more questions. He wanted to push, to ask why Alex had really come over, to ask why she seemed nervous. But a part of him held back. What if he was being paranoid? What if this really was nothing? Or what if it wasn't? That night, the feeling lingered. Emily went about the evening as if nothing had happened, but Mark couldn't stop thinking about the shirt. He couldn't stop replaying the moment he walked in, the way she jumped when she saw him. And as he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, he realized something troubling. For the first time in 7 years of marriage, he wasn't sure if he could trust her. Mark barely slept that night. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling while the moonlight filtered through the half-closed blinds. Emily was beside him, breathing evenly, lost in the kind of deep sleep that seemed impossible to him at that moment. His thoughts churned, restless and insistent, replaying the scene over and over again. The shirt. It wasn't the shirt itself. It was what it represented. It was the way Emily jumped when he walked in, the way her voice had that faint edge of defensiveness. It was the way she folded it too carefully afterward, as if handling something more delicate than just fabric. Mark told himself he wasn't the jealous type. He never had been. In fact, he often prided himself on being the opposite. Trusting, easygoing, not the kind of husband who felt the need to monitor every move Emily made. They had built their relationship on trust, hadn't they? That's what he believed, anyway. But now that trust felt cracked. Not broken, not yet, but fragile. Like glass with a hairline fracture. You can't always see it right away, but eventually, with enough pressure, it shatters. By morning, Mark felt groggy and tense. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, staring out the window at the backyard without really seeing it. Emily moved around the kitchen with the same calm efficiency she always had, making breakfast, humming under her breath, smiling at him over her shoulder. If she noticed the tension in the air, she didn't show it. But Mark noticed something else. Her phone was on the counter. It buzzed softly once, twice. She glanced at the screen, smiled faintly, and tapped out a quick reply before flipping it face down again. It could have been anyone. A friend. A coworker. Even notification from one of those random apps people always forget to turn off. But it didn't feel like nothing. Mark tried to ignore it. He didn't want to be the guy who read too much into a text message. But something gnawed at him. A voice in the back of his mind whispered, "What if it's him?" When Emily left the room to grab something from the laundry, Mark found himself doing something he'd never done before. He picked up her phone. It felt wrong the moment he touched it, the cold weight of it in his hand, the way his heart pounded as if he were doing something dangerous. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for. A name? A message? Proof of something he couldn't even define? But as soon as the screen lit up, he realized he needed a passcode. Mark set the phone down quickly, as if it had burned him. He felt a strange mixture of relief and shame. He hated that he had tried to look. He hated even more that he had wanted to. When Emily came back, he acted like nothing had happened. The rest of the day dragged by. Mark went to work, but he couldn't focus. His mind kept circling back to Alex. Why hadn't his brother mentioned stopping by? It wasn't like they never saw each other. They talked at least once a week, sometimes more. And if Alex was having some kind of problem that made him show up unexpectedly at Mark's house, why go to Emily instead of him? That thought burned the most. By the time Mark got home that evening, the unease had settled into something heavier, suspicion. He didn't want to feel it, but there it was. He tried to shake it off, but every time he looked at Emily, he noticed something else. The way she checked her phone and tilted the screen away slightly. The way she seemed distracted, smiling a little too easily, laughing a little too hard at jokes that weren't that funny. Or maybe he was imagining it. He told himself he was overreacting. After all, he hadn't actually seen anything inappropriate. A shirt was just a shirt. A text was just a text. There were 100 logical explanations. But logical explanations didn't calm the sinking feeling in his chest. Finally, after dinner, Mark couldn't keep it in anymore. He waited until they were alone on the couch, the TV playing softly in the background. Emily was scrolling through her phone, her legs curled up underneath her. "Can I ask you something?" Mark said quietly. She glanced up, eyebrows raised. Of course. Why didn't you tell me Alex came over? Emily blinked. I don't know. It didn't seem like a big deal. Was he okay? Mark asked. I mean, was something wrong? She hesitated. Just for a second. No. He just stopped by. He needed a shirt for something. I don't remember what. You said he asked you to iron it. Yeah. And you didn't think that was weird? Emily sighed, setting her phone down. Mark, why are you making this a thing? He's your brother. I was just helping him out. I'm not making it a thing, Mark said, his voice tightening. It just feels like you're not telling me something. Her expression hardened slightly. What would I not be telling you? He needed help. I helped him. End of story. But it didn't feel like the end of the story. That night, Mark found himself scrolling through Alex's social media, looking for clues. He checked his recent posts, his tag photos, even his last seen status on messaging apps. It felt ridiculous, but he couldn't stop. Nothing. The next morning, he tried calling Alex. No answer. He tried again an hour later. Still nothing. The silence only made the doubt louder. By the third day, the tension between Mark and Emily was impossible to ignore. They spoke less. When they did, the conversation felt forced, like they were both tiptoeing around something bigger. Mark hated it. He hated the way suspicion had slithered into his mind and taken root. He hated the way it made him feel like a stranger in his own marriage. But most of all, he hated the possibility that he might be right. By the fourth day, Mark couldn't take it anymore. The tension in his chest had grown into something unbearable, a constant pressure that made it hard to focus on anything else. At work, his colleagues asked if he was feeling okay. He brushed them off with half-hearted excuses. At home, the silence between him and Emily had become thick and awkward. Every conversation felt rehearsed, like they were both trying too hard to act normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. Mark couldn't let it go. No matter how much he tried to push the thoughts away, they came back stronger every time. He kept replaying everything in his head. The shirt, the way Emily reacted when he caught her, the defensiveness in her voice when he asked questions. It didn't add up. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for anymore. Answers? Closure? Proof that he wasn't crazy? Or proof that he was right? He didn't want to believe the worst. But the seed of doubt had grown roots, twisting and spreading until it touched everything. That evening, after another tense dinner filled with short sentences and forced smiles, Mark decided he couldn't keep guessing. He needed answers. Real answers. If he didn't confront this head-on, it would eat him alive. So he called Alex. His brother picked up on the third ring. Hey, man, Alex said, his voice casual. What's up? Not much, Mark said, trying to keep his tone light. Thought we could catch up. You busy tonight? There was a brief pause. Not really. Why? Come over for a beer, Mark said. I feel like we haven't hung out in a while. Alex hesitated. Yeah, sure. I'll be there in a bit. Mark hung up, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he expected from this conversation, whether it would be tense or awkward, or if he was just overthinking everything. But he knew he needed to look Alex in the eye. He needed to see his reaction when he brought up the shirt. When Alex arrived, they settled on the back porch. The summer air was warm and heavy, carrying the faint smell of freshly cut grass. Mark handed his brother a beer and sat down across from him. They talked about nothing for a while. Sports, work, random small talk that fell hollow to Mark because his mind was somewhere else entirely. He kept waiting for the right moment to steer the conversation where he wanted it to go. Finally, he took a breath. So, Emily mentioned you stopped by the other day. Alex looked up from his beer, blinking. Yeah, I did. Mark watched his face carefully. She said you left a shirt here. Alex nodded slowly. Yeah, I needed it for something. For what? There was the slightest hesitation. Just something for work. Mark tilted his head. Really? I thought you said you weren't working this week. Alex's expression flickered, just for a second. A crack in the facade. Then he let out a soft sigh. Okay, fine. I wasn't working. Mark's stomach tightened. Then why did you lie about it? I didn't lie, Alex said. I just didn't want to get into it. Get into what? Alex looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. I've been going through some stuff. I lost my job a few weeks ago. Mark stared at him. What? I didn't want to tell you, Alex admitted. It's embarrassing. I screwed up. I got laid off, and I've been trying to figure out what to do next. I guess I didn't want to deal with the whole big brother speech, you know? Mark blinked, taken aback. Of all the explanations he had imagined, this wasn't one of them. Why didn't you just tell me? Because I knew you'd make it a thing, Alex said with a shrug. You always want to fix stuff? I didn't need that. I needed someone to talk to. Emily was there. She listened. That's it. Mark felt a wave of guilt crash over him. He had spent days spiraling, imagining the worst, betrayal, lies, something that would break his marriage. And the whole time it had been this. His brother had been struggling, and instead of seeing that, he had let his own insecurities twist the situation into something darker. But there was still one thing nagging at him. Why didn't Emily tell me? Because I asked her not to? Alex said. I didn't want you to know. I wasn't ready to talk about it. Mark exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He felt a mix of emotions, relief, guilt, shame. I thought something was going on between you two. Alex stared at him in shock. Are you serious? I don't know, Mark admitted. The way she was acting, it felt like she was hiding something. She was hiding something, Alex said. But not what you think. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Mark's suspicion hanging heavy between them. He felt embarrassed, stupid, but mostly he felt grateful. Grateful that the truth was something he could live with. I'm sorry, Mark said quietly. I should have just asked you. Alex nodded. Yeah, you should have. When Mark went back inside that night, Emily was sitting on the couch, reading. She looked up when he walked in, her expression cautious. Did you talk to Alex? Yeah, Mark said. And? Mark sat down beside her. I'm sorry, he said. I jumped to conclusions. I thought something was going on between you two. Emily's eyes widened. What? I know. It was stupid, Mark said. I saw the shirt, and I let my mind go to the worst place. Emily sighed, leaning back against the couch. I was just trying to help him. He didn't want you to worry. I know, Mark said. I get it now. I hate that he felt like he couldn't tell me. He was embarrassed, Emily said softly. He'll come around. Mark nodded. I hope so. And as they sat there in the quiet warmth of their living room, Mark realized something important. Trust wasn't about never having doubts. It was about what you did when those doubts crept in. And this time, he was ready to rebuild. The morning after Mark's conversation with Alex felt different. Not because the weight of his doubts had completely disappeared. They hadn't. But because the truth had finally come to light. There's a kind of calm in knowing, even if the knowing itself wasn't perfect. Mark had spent days spiraling, drowning in assumptions. And now that the storm had passed, he was left with something else entirely. Guilt. He sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The house was quiet. Emily was still asleep upstairs, or at least pretending to be. He couldn't blame her if she was avoiding him. He had put her through hell these past few days. She hadn't said much after he admitted his suspicions, just nodded slowly and gone to bed early. But her silence had spoken volumes. Mark hated that he had made her feel like a suspect in her own home, that he had let his imagination get the best of him. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in grand, sweeping apologies. To him, actions always spoke louder than words. But this time, he wasn't sure actions would be enough. When Emily finally came downstairs, her footsteps were soft, tentative. She walked to the coffee machine, poured herself a cup, and sat down across from him without a word. Mark studied her for a moment. Her face was calm, but there was a guardedness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Emily, he said quietly, we need to talk. She nodded slowly, blowing gently on her coffee. Yeah, she said. We do. There was a long pause. Mark wasn't sure where to start. He'd spent so much time overthinking, worrying, and assuming the worst. Now that it was time to actually talk, the words felt tangled in his throat. I'm sorry, he said finally. I really messed this up. Emily looked at him, her expression softening slightly. Yeah, she said. You did. He nodded, accepting it. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. I shouldn't have doubted you. She sighed. It wasn't just that you doubted me, Mark. It was the way you acted. You shut me out. You treated me like I was guilty of something before you even asked me what was going on. I know, he said. I let my insecurities get the best of me. I guess when I saw the shirt and the way you reacted, I panicked. Emily tilted her head slightly. Do you really think I would do that to you? No, Mark admitted. Not deep down. But I started overthinking. I got stuck in my own head, and instead of talking to you, I let it build until I couldn't see straight. Emily was quiet for a moment. She took a slow sip of her coffee, as if she was giving herself time to think. I get why you felt weird about it, she said finally. If I walked in and saw something like that, I'd probably have questions too. But I would have asked you. I would have given you the chance to explain before assuming the worst. Her words hit harder than he expected. Mark wasn't used to being the one who messed up. In their marriage, he had always been the steady one, calm, rational. But this time, he had let his emotions take over. I know, he said. You're right. I should have come to you first. I let my pride get in the way. Emily leaned back in her chair, watching him carefully. I just don't understand why, she said. We've been together for 7 years. I thought we trusted each other. I thought we did too, Mark said. I do trust you. I think maybe I wasn't really doubting you. Maybe I was doubting myself. Emily raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Mark exhaled slowly. I guess. I started wondering why Alex would come to you instead of me. I started thinking, what does that say about me? And instead of dealing with that, I made it about you. Emily's expression softened. You thought he trusted me more than you. Yeah. She nodded slowly. He was embarrassed, Mark. He wasn't trying to shut you out. Sometimes, it's easier to talk to someone who isn't your family. I didn't think it would hurt you this much. It wasn't about him talking to you, Mark said. It was about me feeling left out, like I wasn't needed. Emily reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. You are needed, she said softly, by both of us. But sometimes people just need space to work through things. Mark squeezed her hand gently. I know. I see that now. There was a long silence between them, but this time it felt different. Lighter. I don't want this to hang over us, Mark said. I don't want this to be something we carry around. Me neither, Emily said. But we can't just pretend it didn't happen. I know. He paused. What do you need from me? Emily thought for a moment. I need you to talk to me, she said. When something feels off, when you're upset, don't shut me out. Even if it's uncomfortable. I don't want to guess what you're feeling. Mark nodded. Okay, I can do that. And I need time, she added, to fully forgive you. I'm not mad anymore. But it hurt, Mark. I need to feel like we're on the same team again. He nodded again, slower this time. That's fair. They sat there for a long moment, holding hands across the table. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Life rarely offers those. But it was a start. Over the next few weeks, things slowly began to heal. Mark made an effort to be more open, to communicate instead of retreating into himself. Emily, in turn, gave him the space to work through his insecurities without judgment. He met up with Alex again, too. This time, they talked openly about everything. The job loss, the feelings of inadequacy, and the importance of leaning on each other instead of pushing each other away. In the end, the whole situation wasn't about a shirt or about suspicion. It was about fear of being left out, of not being enough. And once Mark faced that fear, it lost its power. Trust, he realized, wasn't something you built once and then forgot about. It was something you maintained, something you worked on every day. And sometimes it cracked. Sometimes it bent under pressure. But if you were willing to put in the effort, if you were willing to face the uncomfortable truths, it could be rebuilt. And that was exactly what they were doing. One conversation at a time.